No one sat beside her, until the human engineer did without a word. Ships of all sizes docked and undocked, creating a symphony of mechanical hums, thrumming engines, and metallic clangs. Among all this organized chaos, one engineer worked in quiet isolation. Lyra sat at the far end of the maintenance bay, her long, slender fingers moving swiftly over a control panel. Her dark eyes scanned the holographic readouts, her mind calculating and recalculating energy flows, plasma conduits, and the alignment of the station's grav lifts. Her coworkers gave her a wide berth, a silent acknowledgement that she preferred to be alone. Lyra didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it. She had always been different. On her homeworld, she had been considered brilliant but peculiar. Others found her focus intimidating, her silence unnerving. Here on the station, she had carved a small corner for herself where she could work without interruption. Even when the alarms rang or the chatter of the busy station filled the air, Lyra remained detached, immersed in her world of precise calculations and mechanical harmony. Her workstation was a clutter of tools, wires, and half-finished gadgets. It was organized chaos to anyone else, but to Lyra, everything had its place. She adjusted a coil in a grav lift module and tested the flow of energy through the circuits. The display flashed green, signaling a perfect calibration. A small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. Despite her calm demeanor, the isolation sometimes felt heavy. She noticed how no one ever sat beside her during breaks or quiet periods. Even her closest colleagues would pass by with polite nods, keeping a respectful distance. It wasn't that she disliked others. It was more that others didn't seem to understand her, and she didn't expect them to. Lyra's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a loud transport shuttle docking at the bay. She looked up briefly, curious about who had arrived. Most arrivals were routine, cargo haulers or traders, but something in her instincts told her this one was different. The shuttle's ramp lowered, and a figure emerged. The human walked with a relaxed confidence, his tool bag swinging at his side. He wore a simple jumpsuit, slightly worn from use, but he moved with a purpose. Unlike most who would glance around nervously or hurry to report, he walked straight past the other engineers, scanning the modules as if he had a private invitation to the heart of the station. Lyra's attention sharpened. She had never seen him before. Humans were rare on the Andromeda station, and even rarer were those who did not follow the usual protocol of introductions, forms, and verification checks. He approached her workstation and, without a word, pulled up a chair and sat down. She blinked, surprised. Nobody had ever dared to sit beside her, especially not a stranger. Her instincts told her to speak, to question him, to order him away, but for some reason she didn't. She watched as he opened his tool bag and began examining a nearby grav lift module that had been giving her trouble for weeks. He moved with quiet confidence, adjusting wires and recalibrating circuits with deft hands. Lyra noticed small things she had overlooked, slight misalignments, tiny fluctuations in the energy flow. He worked without hesitation, and his understanding of the system was immediate. Lyra studied him in silence. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for permission. He simply worked, and somehow it worked. The module's readings stabilized under his touch, flowing perfectly, responding to adjustments she had spent hours attempting. The human glanced at her briefly, a small, friendly nod, but said nothing. His eyes, a soft brown, held an easy warmth, a subtle confidence that seemed to fill the room without sound. Lyra felt an unfamiliar tug in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and something she hadn't experienced in a long time, trust. Other engineers passing by gave her odd looks. Some frowned in confusion, others whispered among themselves. Lyra barely noticed. She was too busy watching the human, absorbing his methodical approach. It was different from hers, but it was effective. There was an elegance in the way he moved, a simplicity in his actions that contrasted with the complexity she was used to. Minutes passed, and the human finished adjusting the module. He checked the readings once more, satisfied, and then leaned back slightly in his chair. He still had not said a single word. Lyra, who prided herself on observation and understanding, realized she had never encountered someone who could communicate so much without speaking. "Why didn't you introduce yourself?" she finally asked, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. The human smiled, small and easy. "I wanted to see how you work first," he said simply. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, yet there was a sincerity in it that made Lyra pause. She considered responding, But before she could, he reached for another module, this one slightly more complex, and began studying it. Lyra realized she didn't need to give him permission. He was not intrusive in the usual way. He seemed to understand boundaries intuitively, working alongside her without disrupting her space. The station's alarms buzzed briefly, signaling a routine maintenance check in another sector. Lyra ignored it. She had learned to focus amidst distractions, but she noticed the human glance toward the readout, then back at the module. He didn't ignore the station, he adapted. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Lyra and the human, Kale, worked side by side, silently collaborating without any spoken instructions. She adjusted a few coils while he realigned conduits. She tested the energy flow while he monitored the output for fluctuations. They formed an unspoken rhythm, a synergy that neither expected but both recognized instinctively. Finally, Lyra leaned back, stretching her arms. She hadn't realized how tense she had been. Kale watched her briefly, his expression calm, then returned to inspecting a tiny wiring panel. She felt an unfamiliar sensation, companionship. It was subtle, quiet, almost fragile, but it existed. "You're efficient," Lyra said, choosing her words carefully. It was more of an observation than a compliment. She didn't usually give praise. Kale chuckled softly. "So are you. I can see why no one sits beside you." Lyra blinked, startled. The words were not mocking nor dismissive. They were simple, honest, and they carried no judgment. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, trying to understand why his presence felt different from everyone else's. "Why here?" she finally asked. "Why sit beside me?" Kale didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, considering, then returned to adjusting the panel. "Because sometimes it's better to understand before speaking," he said. Lyra found herself nodding slightly. It was not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement. She had spent years alone, assuming no one could understand her methods, her focus. Yet here was someone who didn't try to change her, didn't force conversation, didn't demand attention. He simply existed beside her, quietly observing, quietly helping. As the station lights dimmed for the rotation shift, Lyra realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. The human beside her had entered her world without words, without fanfare, and yet he had made his presence known in the most profound way. The rest of the engineers left for their quarters, their chatter fading into the background. Lyra and Kale remained, the hum of the station around them, their work continuing in silence. There was no rush, no pressure, no expectation beyond the simple act of understanding the machinery and each other. Lyra adjusted a final conduit, and the panel blinked green once more. Kale glanced at it, then at her. For a moment their eyes met, and in that silent glance there was acknowledgement, a recognition of skill, of trust, of something fragile and new that had begun to form. She didn't know why he had come. She didn't know why he chose to sit beside her. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to question it. The human engineer, quiet and unassuming, had crossed the barrier she had built around herself. And she, for the first time in a long while, didn't resist. The station's lights dimmed further, signaling night, yet Lyra didn't leave. She stayed, working alongside Kale, the hum of the engines a comforting background to their quiet collaboration. And in the vast emptiness of space, where loneliness had always been her companion, Lyra felt the faint, unexpected warmth of connection. The following day, the Andromeda trade station stirred to life once more. Traders and engineers moved along the metal corridors, their boots clicking against the polished floors. The hum of energy shields and docking clamps filled the air, but to Lyra, it all blended into the background. She arrived at her workstation with her usual precision, arranging her tools and scanning the modules she had been calibrating the day before. But today, something felt different. She expected the quiet solitude she was accustomed to. Instead, she found Kale already at her side, sitting in the same chair he had occupied yesterday. He didn't look up or speak. He simply unpacked his tools and began examining the nearest module with the same quiet confidence as before. Lyra's brow furrowed. She had not expected him to return so soon, nor had she expected him to resume their wordless collaboration. Normally, strangers gave up after a day or two, or they made some awkward attempt at conversation that disrupted her focus. But Kale, he seemed entirely unaffected by convention. She hesitated, watching him work. His movements were efficient but gentle, precise but instinctive. He adjusted circuits, tightened loose bolts, and recalibrated energy flows, all without a word. Lyra realized she had spent years perfecting her techniques in isolation, yet here was someone who understood her work intuitively. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. Kale looked up for a fraction of a second, offering the same small, easy smile. "I work best when I understand first," he said, returning his attention to the module. He didn't ask her permission, didn't apologize for sitting beside her. He simply existed in her space, working alongside her. Lyra considered this. Humans were unpredictable, impulsive creatures. Most of them would have filled the silence with chatter or worse, criticism. Kale, however, respected the quiet. He was learning through observation, not words, and that intrigued her. She turned her attention back to her own work, silently adjusting conduits while he monitored energy flows. For the first time, she felt a strange sensation, a shared rhythm forming without speech. The human and the alien worked as a single unit, their actions complementary rather than conflicting. Hours passed, and the station grew quieter. Most engineers had retreated to their quarters or social lounges, leaving Lyra and Kale alone. The glow of the modules illuminated their faces, casting long shadows across the floor. Despite the silence, there was an unspoken conversation happening, one of mutual understanding, shared skill, and growing trust. Kale paused, adjusting a minor alignment on one of the energy panels. He glanced at Lyra, not with judgment or expectation, but with curiosity, as if asking her to see what he had done. Lyra studied the panel and realized he had corrected a subtle flaw she hadn't noticed. Her fingers hovered over the controls, then she made a small adjustment to complement his correction. For a moment, they worked in perfect harmony, the air around them charged with quiet energy. Lyra felt a flicker of excitement, the kind that came from discovering something new in a familiar space. She had been alone for so long, certain that no one could match her understanding, and yet here was Kale, demonstrating that humans had a unique approach to problem-solving, intuitive, adaptive, and bold. The silence between them was comfortable. Lyra found herself observing him, noting small details she would have ignored in anyone else. The careful way he handled fragile circuits, the subtle adjustments he made to compensate for temperature fluctuations, the almost imperceptible nod he gave to himself when a correction worked. "You notice everything?" Kale said suddenly, still without looking directly at her. His voice was soft, almost casual, but there was a warmth to it that made her pause. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She wasn't used to conversation during work. She had spent decades communicating through actions and precision, not words. Yet she realized that he wasn't speaking to distract her. He was acknowledging her observation, recognizing her skill. "You could say the same about you," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Kale chuckled softly, the sound blending with the hum of the station. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I just pay attention because I like understanding how things work." Lyra tilted her head, considering. There was a subtle honesty in his words, a simplicity that she found refreshing. Humans often complicated matters with chatter, but Kale's approach was direct, clear, and genuine. She found herself respecting that. As the day progressed, small tasks turned into larger ones. The gravlift modules, plasma conduits, and energy panels demanded attention, each requiring precise calibration and careful adjustment. Lyra had faced challenges like these before, but working alongside Kale made the tasks feel different, almost lighter. His presence was steadying, his silent confidence infectious. The station's automated announcements echoed faintly, signaling routine system checks and docking schedules. Lyra ignored most of them, focusing instead on the modules in front of her. Kale, however, integrated the information seamlessly, adjusting his approach to accommodate shifting priorities. She realized that he had a unique ability to adapt quickly without losing focus. A minor problem arose in one of the gravlift modules. The energy flow fluctuated, threatening to overload the system. Lyra instinctively moved to correct it, but Kale was already there, his hands moving in tandem with hers. They worked silently, intuitively, their actions synchronized without planning. The fluctuation stabilized and the module blinked green once more. Lyra felt a small surge of respect, no admiration for the human. He wasn't just skilled, he was adaptable, confident, and calm under pressure. She had worked with countless engineers before, but none had approached problems with such ease and insight. After the module stabilized, they paused briefly, each studying their own work. Kale leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You work differently from anyone I've met," he said, "but it makes sense. You're precise, deliberate, almost like the machines themselves." Lyra considered this, then nodded slightly. "And you work differently too. You adapt, adjust, improvise." "It's efficient." Her voice carried a hint of wonder, an acknowledgement she rarely gave. Kale smiled again, a small, genuine expression that made Lyra feel something unfamiliar, comfort perhaps, or trust. "I like learning from others," he said simply. The day wore on and the station grew quieter as more engineers left for rest. Lyra and Kale remained, side by side, immersed in their work. The modules hummed, the lights glowed softly, and the two engineers moved in quiet harmony. For the first time in years, Lyra felt less alone. A sudden alert broke the silence, a minor warning about fluctuating energy in the outer docking bay. Lyra instinctively tensed, ready to respond, but Kale was already moving. Without a word, he gestured for her to follow, and together they headed toward the affected modules. The issue was subtle but potentially dangerous. A docking clamp was misaligned, causing minor stress on the energy conduits. Lyra began calculations in her head, but Kale's approach was different. He examined the physical setup, adjusted mechanical components, and then integrated her calculations into his corrections. Working together, they corrected the misalignment quickly and efficiently. Lyra realized that their combined approach, her precision and his adaptability, was more effective than either working alone. She glanced at him, and for the first time she felt a sense of genuine partnership. As the station lights dimmed for the evening cycle, Lyra and Kale returned to their workstation. Neither spoke much. The silence was comfortable, almost companionable. Lyra adjusted a few minor components while Kale reviewed energy readings. "You make quiet look easy," Lyra said finally, almost teasing though her tone was careful. Kale chuckled softly. "I think it's easier when you have someone who understands what you're doing," he replied. Lyra studied him for a moment, then nodded. She didn't need more words. His presence, his skill, his quiet confidence, it all spoke volumes. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of isolation pressing on her. When the station's automated systems signaled the end of the evening cycle, most engineers had already left. Lyra and Kale remained at their workstation, side by side, working through minor calibrations, adjustments, and tests. The silence was not empty. It was filled with understanding, trust, and a growing sense of connection. As Lyra finally shut down her main console for the night, she felt an unexpected warmth. The human beside her had crossed a barrier she had built long ago, a barrier of solitude, of self-reliance, of quiet walls that kept others out. And he had done it without a word, simply by being there, observing, learning, and working alongside her. For the first time in years, Lyra realized something remarkable. Maybe she didn't need to be alone. Maybe, just maybe, someone could sit beside her without disrupting her world, and in doing so make it richer, fuller, and unexpectedly brighter. She glanced at Kale. He was quietly packing his tools, still smiling softly, still patient, still calm. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, anticipation. Tomorrow she knew he would return, and tomorrow perhaps their silent partnership would grow even stronger. For now, though, the station was quiet. The stars outside gleamed faintly through the observation windows, and Lyra allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The next morning, the Andromeda Trade Station was buzzing with activity. Docking clamps released cargo shuttles while maintenance drones zipped along corridors, performing routine checks. Lyra arrived at her workstation, expecting the usual calm rhythm. But the hum of the station today carried an edge of tension, subtle yet unmistakable. Kale was already seated beside her, unpacking his tools with the same quiet efficiency as always. His presence was steadying, yet today he seemed slightly more alert, scanning readouts with quick, careful glances. Lyra studied him silently. She had grown accustomed to his quiet confidence, his intuitive approach to machines, and the sense of calm he brought into her isolated world. "Something feels off," Kale said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but carried focus, and he didn't need to look at her to make his point. Lyra frowned, scanning the main station readouts. She noticed subtle fluctuations in the outer energy shields. The readings were minor, almost within safe limits, but they were unusual. "I see it," she replied. It's small but persistent. Kale nodded, already moving toward the outer docking bay control panel. Let's check it before it grows. They walked swiftly through the corridors, their movements precise and purposeful. Engineers around them paused briefly, observing the pair, curious at the quiet sense of urgency between them. Lyra ignored the stares, focusing on the issue at hand. When they reached the outer docking bay, Lyra's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary fluctuation. One of the external energy conduits feeding the docking clamps was pulsing irregularly, sending unstable energy readings to the main systems. If left unchecked, the conduit could overload, potentially disabling several docking clamps and causing minor structural damage to the bay. Lyra and Kale moved quickly. She calculated adjustments for the conduits, while Kale checked the physical connections, tightening and realigning components with skilled hands. Their actions were synchronized, a silent rhythm developed through days of wordless collaboration. The readings began to stabilize, but then a sudden alarm blared throughout the station. The main screen displayed a warning. A spatial storm was approaching the docking bay at high speed. The storm's trajectory was irregular, and its energy output could easily overwhelm the station's shields. Lyra's heart raced. Spatial storms were rare, unpredictable, and dangerous. While the station was built to withstand minor fluctuations, a storm of this magnitude could strain the energy conduits, destabilize the docking bays, and endanger the ships docked outside. Kale immediately assessed the situation. "We need to stabilize the outer shields," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency. "I'll handle the realignment. You monitor the energy flow and recalibrate as needed." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. She quickly accessed the control panel, analyzing the energy readings in real time. The storm's fluctuating energy pulses were unlike anything she had encountered before. She adjusted the conduits, rerouted excess power, and coordinated with Kale's movements. Time seemed to stretch. Each second mattered. One miscalculation could overload the system, damaging the docking bay and threatening the ships outside. Lyra worked quickly, her fingers moving across the controls in precise, deliberate motions. Kale moved beside her, adjusting mechanical components, reinforcing critical conduits, and rerouting energy lines to prevent overload. Despite the crisis, their silent partnership remained unbroken. They did not need to speak constantly. Their actions communicated more than words ever could. Lyra recognized patterns in Kale's movements, anticipating his next adjustment, while Kale observed her calculations, making complementary corrections. Together, they became a single, cohesive unit. The storm's energy pulses grew stronger, battering the station's outer shields. Red warning lights flashed across the panels, signaling areas of potential failure. Lyra's eyes narrowed, scanning every conduit, every junction, every energy flow. She had faced high-stress repairs before, but this was different. This was life and station critical. A minor explosion of energy sparks flew from one of the conduits. Lyra instinctively moved to stabilize it, but Kale was already there, his hands steady as he redirected the energy through an auxiliary panel. The sparks subsided, and the conduit stabilized, its readings returning to normal. Lyra realized that without Kale's quick action, the system could have failed. "Good work," she said quietly, almost to herself, as she adjusted the next conduit. Kale didn't respond. He was focused, calm, efficient. His presence reminded Lyra that humans could be remarkably adaptable, even in moments of extreme pressure. She felt a flicker of admiration and something else, a growing sense of trust she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Minutes passed like hours. The storm grew closer, its energy pulses more erratic. Lyra and Kale worked tirelessly, moving between modules, recalibrating, adjusting, rerouting energy. The hum of the station was replaced by the crackle of energy sparks, alarms, and the tense vibrations of the shields. At one point, a critical conduit threatened to overload completely. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure if her calculations were sufficient. Kale glanced at her just briefly, then moved with swift precision, redirecting the energy safely. Lyra exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. The storm was still dangerous, but they had gained critical control over the outer systems. Together, they continued their work, each adjustment bringing the station closer to stability. The other engineers had gathered near the main control hub, watching in awe as Lyra and Kale coordinated the stabilization. Many whispered to each other, astonished at the silent efficiency of the pair. Lyra felt a faint sense of satisfaction, not pride exactly, but recognition that their combined skills were making a tangible difference. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storm reached the outermost edge of the station. Lyra and Kale had stabilized the shields, rerouted excess energy, and reinforced every vulnerable conduit. The red warnings subsided, replaced by a steady green glow across the panels. The docking bay had survived the storm without major damage. Lyra slumped slightly in her chair, her muscles tense from hours of focused work. Kale leaned back as well, brushing a smudge of grease from his jumpsuit. He looked at her, a faint smile playing on his lips, and for the first time Lyra felt the full weight of her gratitude. She began, hesitating. You acted quickly. Without you, the conduits might have failed. Kale shrugged, modest yet confident. We worked together. You knew the energy flows. I adjusted the mechanics. It's easier when you combine strengths. Lyra considered his words. Humans often relied on improvisation and intuition, whereas she preferred methodical precision. Yet in the crisis, Kale's adaptability had complemented her careful calculations perfectly. She realized that humans, for all their unpredictability, possessed an innate resilience and resourcefulness. The storm moved away, its energy pulses fading into the distance. The station began its post-storm assessments, automated systems checking the integrity of every module and conduit. Lyra and Kale reviewed the readings, confirming that no damage had occurred. The relief was palpable, but it was also quiet, a shared satisfaction rather than celebration. You stayed calm, Lyra said quietly, almost in admiration. Even when the storm was strongest, Kale smiled faintly. Humans learn to adapt. We face storms all the time, sometimes literal, sometimes not. He didn't elaborate, but his tone carried a quiet honesty that resonated with her. Lyra realized something profound. Kale's calmness, adaptability, and instinctive skill were not just remarkable, they were uniquely human. She had spent years relying solely on her own precision and logic, assuming that no one could match her abilities. Yet Kale had demonstrated that humanity possessed qualities that complemented her strengths in ways she had never considered. As the station settled into its normal rhythm once more, Lyra and Kale returned to their workstation. They continued minor adjustments, recalibrating modules, testing systems, and ensuring that every conduit and panel was functioning perfectly. The day had been exhausting, but there was a sense of accomplishment that neither could ignore. Lyra glanced at Kale. He was quietly working, focused, efficient, and yet his presence no longer felt intrusive. It felt supportive. She realized she was beginning to trust him, not just his skill, but his judgment, his instincts, and his calm composure in the face of danger. For the first time in years, Lyra felt that she was not entirely alone in her work. She had a partner, a human, whose approach differed from hers, whose instincts complemented hers, and whose quiet confidence had proven invaluable in a moment of crisis. The storm had tested more than the station's shields. It had tested her assumptions about humans, trust, and collaboration. And Kale had passed that test silently, efficiently, without a single word. Lyra exhaled, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. The crisis was over, but the experience had changed something within her. She no longer viewed humans as unpredictable or reckless. She saw them as adaptable, resourceful, and capable of rising to challenges in ways that even the most meticulous calculations could not predict. Kale looked at her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. No words were needed. The silent acknowledgement of teamwork, trust, and shared purpose passed between them, stronger than any conversation could convey. As the station lights dimmed for the evening cycle, Lyra allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The storm had come, fierce and unpredictable, yet they had faced it together, and she had discovered that humans, in their quiet, intuitive way, could be extraordinary allies. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of partnership she had never experienced before. And she knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The following day, the station was alive with the usual bustle. Cargo shuttles arrived and departed, maintenance drones zipped along the corridors, and the engineers worked tirelessly to keep everything in perfect order. Lyra arrived at her workstation, expecting the usual calm rhythm, but there was something in the air that felt different, lighter, almost curious. Kale was already there, unpacking his tools with his familiar, quiet efficiency. He gave her a brief nod, the kind of acknowledgement that had become a daily ritual between them. Lyra returned the gesture, though she was still cautious. She had learned to value solitude, to trust few, and yet the human had slowly begun to shift the boundaries she had erected around herself. "Morning," Kale said softly, his voice breaking the silence in the most comfortable way. He didn't press for conversation, didn't linger on pleasantries, simply spoke the word and let it stand. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the panels before her. "Morning," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Words were not her strength, and she had learned long ago that silence could communicate as much, if not more, than speech. Kale began examining a complex energy conduit beside her workstation. His hands moved with skill, adjusting wires, checking flow patterns, and recalibrating minor systems. Lyra observed silently, noting his efficiency, but today she felt a subtle shift. She realized that she had begun to notice more than just his skill. She was noticing his patterns, his habits, even the way he thought through problems. "You adapt quickly," she said finally, her voice almost hesitant. "Faster than I expected." Kale looked up briefly, a small smile forming. "I've had practice," he said simply. Then, without another word, he returned to his work. Lyra studied him for a long moment. There was something remarkable about humans, she realized, something she had never fully appreciated before. They were unpredictable, yes, but also deeply resourceful. They could think on their feet, improvise solutions, and adapt to challenges in ways that pure calculation could not anticipate. As the hours passed, the two engineers continued their silent work, the rhythm between them growing smoother, more intuitive. Lyra made a minor adjustment to a conduit, and Kale immediately compensated for it in the adjacent system. They communicated without words, their actions forming a language of their own, precise, efficient, and harmonious. At one point, Kale paused, looking at her with curiosity in his eyes. "Why do you work alone?" he asked. His tone was gentle, not prying, but it caught her off guard. Lyra hesitated. She was not used to questions about herself, especially not from someone she had only recently begun to trust. It's simpler," she replied finally. "Fewer distractions, fewer mistakes." Kale nodded slowly, as if understanding without judgment. "Humans often work alone too," he said, "but we also learn from others. Sometimes the best solutions come when we combine our strengths." Lyra considered this. She had spent years relying solely on her own precision and calculations, believing that collaboration would only slow her down or introduce errors. Yet she could not deny that, since Kale had arrived, her work had become smoother, more complete. She had been learning from him even without realizing it. "Your approach is different," she admitted, her voice quiet. "It complements mine," Kale smiled faintly. "That's the point," he said. "Different strengths, different methods. Together, we can do more than either of us could alone." Lyra felt a subtle warmth spread through her chest. She had never thought of partnership in this way before. On her homeworld, collaboration often led to friction or mistakes, and solitude had always seemed safer. But with Kale, she had discovered something remarkable. Trust could be quiet, subtle, and powerful. The station's automated systems signaled a routine check of the outer docking bays. Lyra and Kale moved together to assess the modules, their movements synchronized as always. Today, however, there was a lightness to their work, a sense of curiosity and shared discovery rather than urgency or tension. Kale paused at one of the modules, tilting his head thoughtfully. "You notice details most engineers miss," he said. "It's impressive." Lyra studied him for a moment. Praise was not something she gave lightly, but she recognized the truth in his words. "And you adapt to what you see," she replied. "Not many can do that effectively." Kale chuckled softly. "Humans survive by adapting. Sometimes it's the only option." Lyra considered this, adaptation. She had spent her life calculating, predicting, and controlling outcomes. Humans, however, seemed to thrive in uncertainty. Their strength was not just in skill, but in resilience, the ability to respond, to adjust, to rise to challenges that logic alone could not anticipate. A sudden alert interrupted her thoughts. A minor energy surge had been detected in one of the auxiliary conduits. Lyra moved instinctively, analyzing the readings. Kale was already beside her, adjusting the panel with careful precision. Together, they stabilized the surge, their actions seamless and efficient. Afterward, they paused for a moment, observing the system. The minor issue was resolved, yet the sense of satisfaction was palpable. Lyra realized that these moments, working side by side, solving problems and responding to challenges, were building something deeper than professional respect. "You think differently," she said quietly. "Not just in skill, but in perspective," Kale nodded. "We all have different ways of thinking. The trick is to combine them. That's how humans innovate, by learning from others, adapting, and trying new approaches." Lyra studied him carefully. She had always believed that logic, precision, and careful calculation were enough. But Kale had shown her that creativity, intuition, and adaptability were equally important. She realized that humans had a unique balance of thought and action, one that complemented her own meticulous methods. As the day progressed, Lyra and Kale continued to work, occasionally exchanging brief words, though their silent understanding remained dominant. They tested energy flows, recalibrated conduits, and inspected modules with care. Each action reinforced their trust, their shared rhythm, and their growing partnership. During a brief pause, Kale leaned back, wiping a smudge of grease from his jumpsuit. "You've built impressive systems here," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "It's not just precision, it's vision. You see patterns others don't." Lyra felt a subtle pride, though she kept her expression neutral. "Vision is only useful if it works in practice," she replied. Kale smiled. "And practice is better when shared," he said simply. Lyra considered this. Practice had always been solitary for her. But shared practice, with someone she could trust, had revealed new possibilities, new efficiencies, and even a sense of companionship she had not thought possible. Later, they were called to inspect a series of gravlift modules near the central docking bay. Lyra led the technical assessment, calculating energy flows and potential stress points. Kale moved alongside her, observing, adjusting, and offering input through actions rather than words. Their teamwork was effortless, a dance of intellect and intuition. As they worked, Lyra found herself reflecting on humanity in a way she had never done before. Humans were messy, unpredictable, and often reckless, but they were also resilient, adaptable, and capable of remarkable insight. Kale embodied these traits perfectly, calm under pressure, quick to adjust, and intuitive in his problem-solving. "You handle uncertainty well," Lyra remarked quietly as they stabilized another module. Kale looked at her, tilting his head slightly. "Humans have to. Space, storms, machines, life itself is uncertain. We survive by thinking, adapting, and acting." Lyra nodded slowly. She had spent her life avoiding uncertainty, relying on calculation and control. Yet here was a human who thrived within it, transforming potential chaos into opportunity. She realized that she had much to learn from him, not just about machines, but about perspective, adaptability, and trust. The day drew to a close and the station's lights dimmed. Lyra and Kale returned to their workstation, completing minor calibrations and reviewing the day's adjustments. The modules hummed steadily, energy flows stable, and the docking bay was secure. "You make quiet meaningful," Lyra said finally, almost as an observation rather than a compliment. Kale smiled softly. "Sometimes quiet says more than words," he replied. Lyra studied him, realizing that this human, so different from any she had encountered, had begun to change her understanding of the world. His presence, patience, and adaptability had taught her that collaboration could be powerful, that trust could be quiet, and that humanity possessed a resilience she had never fully appreciated. As the station settled into the evening cycle, Lyra felt a rare sense of peace. She had spent years relying solely on herself, believing solitude was necessary. Yet Kale's quiet partnership had revealed a new possibility. Understanding, trust, and growth could emerge through observation, action, and shared purpose. For the first time, she felt a sense of connection that did not require words, explanations, or promises. She and Kale had faced challenges together, solved problems side by side, and built an unspoken understanding that was stronger than any protocol or procedure. Lyra glanced at Kale, who was quietly packing his tools for the day. The smile on his face was simple, genuine, and reassuring. She realized that humanity in its quiet strength had earned her respect, and perhaps in time her admiration. As the station lights dimmed further, Lyra allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The human beside her had taught her something profound. That trust, understanding, and connection could be built silently, through action, observation, and shared purpose. And she knew that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together. The Andromeda trade station glowed softly under the light of distant stars. The hum of energy shields and docking clamps filled the corridors, but there was a quiet calm today, a sense of anticipation in the air. Lyra arrived at her workstation, her eyes scanning the modules and conduits as usual, but there was an unusual lightness in her step. The last storm had tested the station and herself, and she felt stronger for it. Kale was already there, seated beside her, unpacking his worn tool bag. He glanced up briefly, offering a small nod, a gesture that had become a daily ritual. Lyra returned it, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Their silent partnership had grown over days, forged through observation, action, and mutual trust. Today, however, there was something unspoken between them, an awareness that their collaboration had become more than professional. "Morning," Kale said softly, his voice breaking the silence in the most comfortable way. "Morning," Lyra replied, her voice calm yet warm. Today's tasks involved a full inspection of the station's central docking systems. Ships of all sizes were arriving and departing, and the station's efficiency depended on flawless coordination between grav lifts, energy conduits, and docking clamps. Lyra's meticulous calculations had always kept the system running smoothly, but with Kale's adaptability and intuitive adjustments, she realized they could achieve a level of precision and efficiency that surpassed anything she had accomplished alone. As they moved from module to module, Lyra noticed something remarkable. The other engineers who once avoided her now glanced toward her workstation with curiosity and even admiration. Whispers of their combined effectiveness traveled through the station. Lyra did not seek recognition, but she felt a subtle sense of satisfaction. Not for herself, but for the fact that her work, and now Kale's presence beside her, was making a tangible difference. At one of the docking clamps, a small misalignment threatened to slow the arrival of a cargo shuttle. Lyra began calculating the necessary adjustments when Kale quietly moved beside her, examining the clamp with practiced intuition. Without speaking, he adjusted a support brace and realigned the conduit, allowing Lyra's calculations to flow seamlessly into the repair. The clamp operated perfectly, and the shuttle docked safely. "You handle calculations well," Kale said quietly, glancing at her. "I handle adjustments. Together it works." Lyra considered this, then nodded slightly. "Yes, together it does." There was a quiet moment of understanding between them. Words were unnecessary, their shared actions spoke volumes. Lyra realized that the human beside her had become not only a partner in work, but a partner in trust, learning, and discovery. The day grew busier. Traders arrived from distant systems, docking shuttles full of rare metals, exotic plants, and delicate machinery. The station's energy flows fluctuated with each new arrival, demanding constant attention. Lyra and Kale moved swiftly between tasks, their coordination flawless. Where one saw a problem, the other anticipated the solution. Where one hesitated, the other acted. Their combined skills transformed potential chaos into harmony. At one point, a minor error appeared in a newly installed grav lift system. Lyra calculated the adjustments, but the readings were unusual, slightly off the expected pattern. Kale examined the physical module, adjusting braces and testing energy conduits. Together, they corrected the error before it could escalate. Lyra paused for a moment, realizing once again how adaptable humans could be. Kale's intuition complemented her precision perfectly. "Humans are," she began, then paused. Words were not her usual mode of expression, but she felt compelled to articulate the thought. Kale looked at her, curious. "We are resourceful," she said finally. "Adaptable, calm when things are uncertain. You anticipate without calculations. You think differently, yet it works." Kale smiled faintly. "We learn from necessity," he replied, "but we also learn from others. Working with you, I've learned more than I expected." Lyra studied him. There was a truth in his words, a quiet honesty that resonated deeply. She had always relied on logic and precision, believing that collaboration would complicate rather than enhance her work. Yet Kale had proven otherwise. Humans, she realized, were capable of rising to challenges in ways that combined strength, intuition, and creativity. As the day continued, a new challenge emerged. A transport shuttle carrying rare materials reported a minor malfunction while approaching the docking bay. Its energy signature was unstable, and it risked damaging the bay if not guided carefully. Lyra and Kale moved quickly. Lyra calculated the adjustments needed to stabilize the shuttle's docking pattern, while Kale monitored the mechanical systems, adjusting energy flows and grav-lift alignment in real time. The shuttle's approach was tense, each second critical. Lyra's calculations flowed rapidly, her mind mapping energy conduits and docking vectors with precision. Kale responded immediately, his intuitive adjustments preventing overloads and stabilizing the systems. Together, they guided the shuttle safely to the bay. The other engineers watching the operation were silent, impressed by the seamless coordination between the two. When the shuttle finally docked safely, Lyra and Kale exchanged a glance. No words were needed. The shared sense of accomplishment was clear, a quiet acknowledgement of their partnership. Lyra felt a sense of pride, not in herself, not in the human, but in what they had achieved together. The rest of the day passed in similar harmony. Lyra and Kale continued inspections, adjustments, and calibrations, each task reinforcing their rhythm, each action deepening their trust. Lyra began to notice something subtle. Her isolation was fading. The station no longer felt like a place of solitude. It was a space of collaboration, learning, and growth. During a brief pause, Kale looked at her with curiosity. "You've changed since I arrived," he said softly. "You seem more open, more willing to let others help." Lyra considered this. He was right. She had spent years shielding herself, relying only on her own skill and precision. But Kale had taught her that collaboration was not weakness, it was strength. His quiet presence had shown her that humans could be trusted, that their adaptability and resilience complemented her meticulous nature perfectly. "You adapt quickly too," she replied. "Not just to machines, but to people. You understand without needing words." Kale smiled faintly. "Sometimes action speaks louder than words," Lyra nodded. The storm, the crises, and the long hours of shared work had taught her more than she could have imagined. Humans, in their quiet, persistent way, had shown her the value of trust, intuition, and partnership. As the evening cycle approached, the station began to quiet. Most engineers had left, leaving Lyra and Kale alone once more. They returned to their workstation, checking final readings, performing last calibrations, and reviewing energy flows. The modules hummed steadily, all systems functioning perfectly. "You make work feel," Lyra began, searching for the right words, "less lonely." Kale looked at her, a faint smile on his face. "And you make it meaningful," he replied. Lyra felt a warmth she had not experienced in years. Their silent partnership had grown into something extraordinary, a combination of skill, trust, and mutual respect that had transformed her understanding of collaboration. She realized that humans were remarkable, not because they were flawless, but because they adapted, learned, and persevered. As the stars outside the station shimmered in the distance, Lyra allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. The human beside her had not only crossed her barrier of solitude, but had taught her the true meaning of partnership. She had learned that trust could be quiet, that connection could be built through shared effort, and that humanity's resilience and adaptability were qualities worth admiring. Kale glanced at her, still smiling softly. "Tomorrow will bring new tasks," he said quietly. "But we'll handle them together." Lyra nodded, feeling a sense of certainty she had never known before. Together, they could face any challenge, adapt to any uncertainty, and create solutions that neither could achieve alone. As the station lights dimmed and the hum of machinery settled into a steady rhythm, Lyra realized something profound. She was no longer alone. The human engineer had proven that collaboration, trust, and understanding could flourish quietly, steadily, and powerfully. She had found a partner, not only in work but in learning, growth, and perhaps something more. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt truly ready for the future. The stars outside continued to shine, distant and constant. The station remained a beacon of order and innovation. And inside, at a quiet workstation filled with the hum of energy modules, two engineers, alien and human, worked side by side, united by skill, trust, and the unspoken understanding that together, they were stronger than they had ever been alone. In that quiet partnership, humanity shone brightly, not in words, not in grand gestures, but in quiet resilience, adaptability, and the simple, profound act of standing beside another and working together toward a common goal. The future, Lyra realized, was not something to face alone. It was something to share, and with Kale beside her, she was ready.